say it again. It's a proverb. Through wisdom is a house built, and by knowledge it is established, and its chambers are filled with pleasant and precious riches. We welcome you today to our legacy, ethics, action, values, educational seminars. And we enjoyed last week our Black History celebration, and our students came and they offered, our MLK celebration, and our students came and they were just amazing. And today stands to be no less, as we will welcome one of our very own. But before we begin, we'd like to start singing our Negro national anthem, Lift Every Voice and Sing. So all you singers, I want you to stand, warm your vocal cords up with us. We have the musician, and let's sing it all together. I invite you to stand. If you can't see the screen on page 150, you can find it in your hymnal. Let me be, as you take your seat, one of the beautiful things that I love about us being in this intimate space is that we have the opportunity to continue to teach you about proper etiquette. And etiquette is just the way of doing something. And when we sing our national anthem, we invite you to stand out of respect. And so that is why I took my pastoral cue and I was trying to cue you to stand. So we want to always make sure that at Lincoln we owe you the information that you need so that you will observe proper etiquette. Amen? We welcome you again to our convocation, and we've been reading some of, as part of our MLK celebration, we've been reading different things. Last week we had excerpts, the students gave different excerpts, and so we invite you now to share with us in this meditation, and I'm going to ask that we read it collectively. Hopefully you can see it. I think my eyes are playing tricks on me, but hopefully you can see it together. So I'm going to do a test now. Let us all stand and read this meditation together, all of us, everywhere. Thank you. And let us read it together. Eternal God, out of whose mind this great cosmic universe, we bless thee. Amen. As you take your seat, I thought that it was very interesting to see that this was Martin Luther King's, one of his prayers that he prayed in 1949. So he actually would have been around your age, students, but for him to have that kind of concern about humanity. So we thought that that would be a great inclusion. We'd like to welcome one of our students who will come and introduce herself. We asked her to come and just to share about the purpose of our gathering. Will you come and introduce yourself to the community?
Good morning, Lincoln University. I am Nkechi Oj. I am from Nigeria. I am a sophomore, graduating class of 2020. This morning, I am here to share the purpose of this Leaf's convocation. Community is defined as a group of people having a particular characteristic in common. I am glad to be a part of the Lincoln University community. Today, we will enjoy the gathering of family as we welcome again Ms. Corinna Fales, who will share reflections about her book titled Difference. Thank you.
Can we give acknowledgement for community? We are also, she is? Okay. At this time, we also wanted to, the convocations, believe it or not, are about students taking leadership and roles and being a part. So we are trying to give that back to you students. And in effort of our students sharing the myriad of gifts that they have, we've invited one of our students to come and to share, one of our voice majors to come, and they will share a selection with us. And so if they will come at this time, and you are welcome to introduce yourself to our community, so you can stand here or there. Okay. All right. Very good.
Good morning. My name is Jewel Lee. I'm a first semester senior here at Lincoln University. I just want to welcome all Lincoln students, faculty, friends, and family. I am here to introduce and welcome our speaker, Corinna Fales. If you turn to the back of your first page, there's a little piece about her that I'll be reading. Plunging readers into disturbing and contemporary terrain of the human heart, the author, a daughter of Jewish refugees, interviews individuals from Lincoln University, where she grew up before passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. From a prominent black civil rights leader to the white son of the alleged KKK member, her interviews form an original history that illuminates our strengths and our universal difficulty with diversity. We have become so guarded and careful, so concerned about saying the wrong thing, that we do not interact or communicate genuinely with one another or each other. Fear, dishonesty, politically disguised as kindness and sensitivity abort the possibility of change. But the down-to-earth community portrait of Lincoln University that emerges indifferent, and the author's realistic and refreshing perspective on the human beings we are, create the breathing space and a way to move forward. Ever wonder why we have always had a troubled relationship with the fact that we are different, the very fabric of human existence? Here's why, and here's hope. Let's welcome our author and guest speaker, Corinna Fales.
To be on the stage of this beautiful building where I spent so many years sitting where y'all are sitting, listening to recitals here and just dreaming on. So it's very wonderful and weird for me to be up here. King's quote is so perfect for today, and I'm grateful for that quote. What I'm talking about is, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men and women are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. So what I'm going to do is read some excerpts from my book. I've asked Professor Sotilio to go like this if it gets too long, because I'm really interested in interacting with you and hearing what you all have to say and think. I don't want to just listen to myself talk. One quick thing, you may notice there's a difference between the picture of the book and the program and the picture of the book up here. That's because I was not happy with the publisher, and so I took it upon myself to redo it. So this is the new version here, and I've also added some pieces to the book that are in this version that are not in the previous one that I think they're short, but I think they help the book a lot. So I grew up in Lincoln University at a time when the local schools and facilities in Oxford were segregated. A community where blacks and whites lived together and socialized on an equal footing, both within and beyond their community, was virtually unheard of during the 1940s and 50s. But Lincoln was always different. And so were those of us who grew up there. Or were we? I interviewed a group of us with the intent of creating a sort of lyrical group memoir about an enchanting place, then slowly realized that the book I was given was far more complex and altogether different from the one I had envisioned. I had inadvertently stumbled upon an ancient and universal theme, prejudice, and I felt obliged to follow where it led. There were actually two Lincolns, side by side, the university campus and the Lincoln Village, and the distance between them was far greater than the narrow road that connects them. I lived in them both. My father, who taught at the university, died when I was 8, and we were required to move out of our campus home. My mother eventually found a house she could afford to rent in the village, and we moved, literally and figuratively, across the railroad tracks. That experience of growing up in both Lincolns gave me the perspective that called this book into being. It might seem that I'm going to write about race or about race and class, but my larger focus here is the age-old and worldwide aversion we all tend to have to any kind of difference, and why I think prejudice is so important to us that it has caused suffering and devastation throughout human time. Theoretically, we could just as easily be predisposed as a species to value, appreciate, and celebrate difference, but we aren't, and we don't, and we never have. Why is that? This is the fundamental question I finally had to grapple with, and it has become my purpose here to signify this universal human characteristic within the context of our Lincoln community, and to set existing research on diversity into the context of the personal story. If we want genuine change, I have come to believe that we need to address diversity in a new way, with courage, honor, and integrity, not with political correctness. Lincoln was a tiny rural place, so many of us knew each other or knew of each other. The campus kids knew each other, the village kids knew each other, and some of us from both communities knew each other, primarily because we went to school together. We were black and white, light-skinned and dark-skinned, financially secure and extremely poor, highly educated and barely educated, the children of refugees and the great-grandchildren of slaves. You will hear what we thought of each other, what we didn't know about each other, and what we thought we knew about each other but didn't know. We loved each other and hurt each other. You will hear many sides of the same issues and events, as well as things that were known only to the person speaking. Perhaps you will question what you believe or think you know, or even who you think you are. It's all part of the human territory we will cover together as we journey down through Lincoln's social layers, from the campus kids to the village kids to the poorest of the poor. It was a great privilege to learn so many years after we grew up together what people really thought and went through and came through. The Lincoln we grew up was so alive and so proud, but it was neither a paradise nor an equally happy place for all of us. Why, for example, would the first HBCU experience an unusually high number of suicides among the black children of its faculty and administrators? What was it like to grow up in such a place, literally sprung forth in the middle of cornfields, at such a time and in almost total isolation? What did our parents tell us and teach us? What did we make of people who were different from us? How did our parents and children deal with the segregated schools in the Lincoln Village and the segregated Quaker-owned swimming pool in Oxford? And how did the village and campus communities interact? The village has a long and complicated relationship with the campus that stretches back for generations and into its Hinsonville beginnings. As Sandra Draper, who grew up in the village, and some of you may know, told me, walking up onto the campus from her village home felt like, quote, treading on hallowed ground. In their book, Hinsonville, A Community at the Crossroads, Paul and Mary Ann Russo, who taught at Lincoln, wrote, the university bought up Hinsonville's farms and businesses, forcing the displacement of the community's demographic center. Concurrently, following the arrival of the railroad less than a mile south of Hinsonville in the early 1860s, a new settlement of both whites and blacks was growing on once useless swampland that now lay along the railroad tracks. This new community, called Lincoln University Village, absorbed many of the residents of Hinsonville, but it grew in new and different directions. Where Hinsonville had been a community of farmers, Lincoln Village was a community of laborers. This is the place I moved to when I was 9, the place that Mrs. Christy Palmer Lee, a native of the village, referred to as, quote, the little community behind the university for us colored folks, unquote. Many village homes had outhouses, as did the village schools. Chickens ran around with or without their heads, and village culture and social rules were frequently new to me. Most adults were very poor, far less formally educated, note formally educated, then the faculty and administrators of the university, and worked in service capacities on the campus and elsewhere. It was a much more down-to-earth environment than the privileged and sheltered one in which I had grown up, and there was not a single suicide within the village community. One of the most valuable things I learned from living in the village was what it feels like to live on the other side of the tracks, because everything really did change, from the friendships I'd had since childhood to our food. I was in my 40s before I realized how poor we had been. The people I interviewed for Different traveled from Julian Bond, whose name I'm sure you know, to Frankie Weaver, who lived in the village. Frankie was the son of a man widely alleged to have been a KKK member, and he was also the only white child who attended the village school for blacks. How did that happen, and what was the result? Different presents a story that is full of surprises. I watched as the individual stories I was told wove themselves together to tell a story of this community that helps us to understand ourselves and each other, and that shows how people, even those who do not know each other, are integrally related, whether they are aware of or not, and whether they like it or not. In this way, Different, the book as a whole, aligns with today's theme. Lincoln was a truly exceptional and extraordinary place. But for all its remarkable qualities, it was still a human place. So let me tell you about it, and let me share with you these stories which carry the love, prejudice, anguish, hope, and longing for community that affect all of us everywhere. The first is an excerpt from Bonnie Southern, the daughter of Orrin Southern, whose music changed Lincoln, whose recitals I sat here and listened to. Okay, so Bonnie says, "The funny thing is that I didn't know I was a black person until I moved to Lincoln. The person who made me aware of it was Jimmy McCrae, who was the son of then Dean of Students and also a black child, because one day he called me a nigger. Oh, yes, he did. I went running home to my mother. He called me a nigger, and my mother's mouth dropped open to the floor because she hadn't talked to me about race. She said she hadn't talked to me about it before we moved to Lincoln because she was light-skinned and had green eyes. So she got it from the black folks. You think you're high and mighty because you have this coloring. And then she got it from the white folks who knew what she was and didn't want her. So she said she was not even going to mention it to us until we brought it up. Until Jimmy McCrae called me that, I had no clue. When my mother asked me, what does that mean to you? All of this stuff started coming out that I didn't even know was in me in terms of other people's reaction to black people. They drink and they do this and they do this and they do this. My mother was absolutely appalled. That's when she started talking with me, and it took me a while. I remember that I had some friends that came from Chicago and were brown-skinned, but one of their children was really dark, and he liked me. I didn't want to be anywhere around him, only on the basis of skin color. This is when I was going through this period of, I don't want to be black, I don't want to be like them because this is what they do. And Mama said, you are they, so you have to deal with this. I really had to work to get through that. When we moved to Lincoln, I was 8, and I already had negative feelings that I didn't even know I had. Even then I thought, geez, where did all this come from? It's all around, in the papers, and how you're treated, and in conversations. But I was this little innocent person who was just kind of waltzing through it, not thinking about it. I knew exactly what Jimmy McCrae meant when he called me a nigger, which is why I burst into tears and ran home. I'll never forget that. It made me realize that I was one of them. My quick note on that is just environment affects all of us. And we are all connected, and everyone is affected consciously and unconsciously, whether we know it or not. And that also includes white people. Can we realistically expect them not to be racist in a society where racism is this systemic and pervasive? The second excerpt is from Sandra Draper, a very close friend and the first village resident to graduate from Lincoln. And she was crying through much of this. When I went to Lincoln, I got a senatorial scholarship and some aid. Then I worked to put myself through college. I only had to pay for my books. I didn't have to pay for tuition or for board or food. I could eat on campus and go to school because my father worked on the grounds. I felt very, very proud that I was able to get into Lincoln. And then, maybe in my second year, it was difficult for me to be one of the 12 women on campus at the time, with about 500 fellows, because the male students weren't very kind to us, especially if you weren't beautiful. Mean things were said, and laughs were directed toward me. It depended on what you looked like in their eyes. Skin color mattered, and looks mattered. Other fellows would come to your defense, but you still heard what had been said. So it was pretty tough for the first 6 months until they got used to the fact that we weren't going anywhere. And then we had 500 brothers. Those times were a test of strength, because if you were going to do something, you had to put up with a lot of things that were not always pleasant or in your favor. There was strength in the village, families in the village, even though as kids we might have been made to feel that we weren't as good as somebody else because of the clothes we had on or the fact that we didn't have as much money. In the recesses of our minds, we remembered the things we were told about who we were and that we didn't have anything to be ashamed of. My mother was great at instilling that in us because she worked in the homes of some of the professors. She was always treated well, but she saw a different side too, and she always told us that we were as good as anybody else. My note on this is Son almost dropped out of Lincoln actually at one point because it was so hard on her, but she kept the courage and the strength to be who she was ought to be, and as a result, the guys on campus became who they were ought to be. And here a quick shout out to my mom, who was the first woman to graduate from Lincoln. The final excerpt is Marita Rivero, or of the interviews, is Marita Rivero, daughter of Manuel Rivero, namesake of Jim. Lincoln grounded me in many ways, and I owe much of what I've been able to do to the family I grew up in and also to that environment. I think my parents were busy using opportunities to explain race to their children in ways that would not deflate and defeat us. I remember asking my mother, but why don't white people like us? Why? Why? And I can still hear her frustration in her voice when she finally said, because, Marita, the white man is preposterous. Marita cracks up. I said, oh, okay. So if they didn't like me, it was on them. It had nothing to do with me. They were preposterous. That was terrific. She laughs more. I also remember my mother explaining that our people came from Africa. She didn't explain slavery, just that we were rooted somewhere. Well, my brother Juan was kind of a hanger-on listening to all of this, and I think he was 5 or 6, so I would have been 9 or 10, and he piped up with, so Marita's an African? My mother said yes. Well, Juan went into wild laughter and ran out of the house to tell everyone on the campus, Marita's an African, Marita's an African, because when we grew up, Lincoln had a high percentage of African students, and they seemed different from us. They were Africans, and we were not. Marita's just laughing through this whole thing. In morning devotions at the tiny school in the village, we all sang 2 songs from America's Songbook, and that book was written in dialect. But we didn't know it was dialect, so we're all singing DeKalb Town Ladies, sing this song, doo-dah, doo-dah. We'd sing it just the way it was written. We'd sing Old Black Joe. She's absolutely cracking up. I'm coming, but my head is hanging low. She's laughing nonstop. We loved those songs. Someone said later, why didn't your mother and father stop that? I'm sure they didn't know. She said, I talked to Julian Bond about this. He said his father stopped it. And I said, well, as soon as you graduated, Julian, they went back up on the blackboard. She laughs. And I asked her, but they had no meaning to you? And she said, no, they had nothing, because no one had told her anything about it. It didn't mean anything to her. And then she told a story. The doorbell was ringing, and I said, there's a white man on the porch. Daddy got up annoyed and said, that's not a white man, that's a man. And I said to my mother, what's he talking about? It is, too, a white man. She laughs. She said, well, Marita, you know those pictures of little pickaninnies and books who were bug-eyed? There's a white man on the porch. Your father does not have that view of the world. And I guess he was disappointed that despite everything he said about how every man puts his pants on one leg at a time, despite everything he's done, his daughter still tells him that there's a white man on the porch. She laughs. It isn't that we ignored race altogether. When my parents gave parties, they would say, all the white people are going to show up between 8 and 8:15, and the black people aren't going to come till 8:30 or so, but they'll stay till 10:30 or 11, and all the white people will go home at 10. My mother was running around, oh God, my hair isn't ready, what time is it? You know the Joneses are going to be here at 8, who's going to answer the door? And she's cracking up. She says it was that kind of sense that we're different people, we had different mores, and of course, my mother was very clear politically about the struggle. This is what's been going on, and your grandparents were involved, etc. So we knew all about our family and the efforts they'd made to fight segregation and a lot of history, but we weren't seen as being oppressed. We were to fight the fight against these people who were so stupid and had power to impose stupid restrictions on us because we were every bit as good as they were. A leadership role was implied there, though we were never told we had to lead anything or do anything. We just didn't have to put up with that. You're an intelligent person, and you weren't supposed to hide from reality, and you were supposed to go on with your life. And that entailed having to take on some of the larger issues. But that was to push back enough for you to be able to live your life the way anybody else can. It's a push to recognize your right as a human being to live your life as fully as you can. Sometimes we'd be sitting out in the backyard on a summer night, and we just have finished this wonderful meal, and friends are over, and my parents were having iced tea or whatever. And my dad would say, "I wonder what the white man's doing today." The implication being, it doesn't get any better than this. So I think the idea was that we're going to enjoy our life. We're going to enjoy this life and make it as full as it possibly can be, and we'll fight for that. But we're not going to ruin our whole life feeling, oh, I wish I were white. I didn't get this. I can't do that. It's not worth it to get up in the morning because they boxed me in over here and they did this and that. That is not how we're going to approach life. My comment on that is, Marita would not be less than what she ought to be. She and her family did not see themselves as oppressed, which would have happened if they had defined themselves and their possibilities by the discrimination they faced. Marita chose to be what she was and ought to be, did not wait until whites were who they ought to be, but kept her sense of self, her soul, her laughter, and her life, all part of who she was and ought to be, and actually became a leading and influential figure in the world of public broadcasting. Cut it? Okay, then I won't say my ending. So I just would love to have feedback from y'all. Any questions, any thoughts, any comments? Please.
All due respect to Sonia Draper, she was not the first black student from the village to graduate from the university. She might have been the first female. But the Scarrett family in the 40s started graduating every son that they had.
Oh, interesting.
Thank you. Daughter, Dean Scarrett, had to go to another college because they were not accepting women in 1943. So if you go back and look at your rolls, you'll see this. I think at least 3 Scarrett boys graduated from Lincoln, and their father worked here at the university, I think, in the kitchen.
I apologize for that, and I thank you for the information. That's very helpful. Thank you. Yes.
My name is Robert Millett, and I apologize for being late. I had another meeting that I had to attend to. And could you share with us 2 things? One, regarding the Walls family, my neighbors. I live in the village. When I first came to Lincoln several years ago, I was advised by some of my colleagues on campus that to buy a home in the village was not a very good idea. That's the best investment I've made in my entire life, in terms of profit. So if you could share something with us about the Walls family and a person by the name of Gladys Renwick, I would greatly appreciate that. I bought my house from Gladys Renwick.
Oh. I don't have a lot to share. I mean, I knew Gladys Renwick. I knew her from the refectory here, what we used to call the refectory. And she was just a wonderful woman and a fine spirit that I knew as a child and I loved a lot. And I remember when they moved there, actually they moved to the village, and that was, actually when I think about it, it's kind of surprising. You're bringing me back. I have to get my little brain going there. But I mean, I don't have a lot to say about her except I loved living in the village, and she personally was a delight. And is Tyson Walls here? Tyson, do you want to say something, Tyson? To what he was saying? Not Tyson Walls, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Tyson Gray. Right.
And, you know, my father is a historian he does genealogy for all the families here, but my family is the Walls family, and a lot of the history that you see around here comes from my family. We had the land before it was Lincoln University, and a lot of the graves that you see out front, well, the reason why there's a chapel is because we made a deal with the people that took the land to always preserve my family. And so you have generals and all types of history right there at the gate right there at the chapel. So when you do the history of what Lincoln University is, and I know that it says that a lot of the people that were in the village were from families of slaves and things, but the Walls family doesn't really have slave history in it. It's very hard to see that, and that's one thing that I'm proud about when my father does the genealogy, is the fact that I can go around and tell other people, if you do your history, you might be even greater than what you think of yourself, because a lot of times we look down on ourselves being as though we're from, you know, we come from slaves and this, that, and the third, but we also were very educated, smart, business savvy type of people as well. So just from the Walls aspect, I encourage you to do a lot more of your personal history. We learn a lot of history of everybody else when we go to school, but learn how to do your personal genealogy so you can know your own story, and one day you'll be sitting up there on the stage telling your personal history of what you know.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Dr. Jean-Bernard Sarin. I'm the voice professor here at Lincoln University. First of all, thank you for being here and for reading those stories. This is my 5th semester teaching here at Lincoln, and the beginning of my 2nd semester living on campus in the faculty guest house. And I've been struck by how isolated we are here. To be honest, I've never felt segregated America more in some ways than being here on campus. I've visited several small universities, but there's always like a downtown within walking distance. But here, when you're here, you're just here. There are no businesses. Has it always, you've mentioned walking across the train tracks, has it always been an hour walk to civilization from Lincoln? And what do you think the future is for that? Is it always going to be like this here?
Yep, it's always been that way here, and there are references to it in the book. Because as kids got older, like as Bonnie Southern got older, she was saying there's just nowhere to socialize other than here and stuff. And it is very unique. Well, it's either unique or not. It's unique about Lincoln that it is just here. I mean, in the village, there were never more, when I was around, well, in my time, let's put it that way, then there was Mr. Lewis's store, which, you know, had like basic supplies and popsicles and stuff like that. And at one place there was like sort of more of a market there called Vernon's Market. But basically, no, you're right. This is it. Always has been it. Right.
Okay. My name is Oliver Franklin. I entered in 1962 and left in 1966. Every Wednesday at 11 o'clock, the whole school would be here. We had so few students, we would always meet here every Wednesday, and you had to sign yourself in. The whole school could get in. We're isolated because we are the first black university. 1853 was when they were looking for a place to found an academic school, and nobody would sell land to people who wanted a black institution. Mr. Henson, who is related to the Walls, had 7 children, and in 1850 they had the Fugitive Slave Bill, which means that they could come up and grab black people and send them south. His youngest child disappeared. They searched and searched for a week, and when they knew they couldn't find her, they realized she'd been snatched, and the entire family went to Toronto. Mr. Henson died, and when his relatives discovered that Dr. John Miller Dickey was looking for a place, they allowed this land, which was his farm, to become Ashman Institute, which became Lincoln University. Why was it valuable? Because it was on a hill. It was high. So what is it? Malaria. I've been reading about, sorry. All day in the paper, it's about legalizing marijuana in Pennsylvania. I've been reading. Anyway, malaria. So it was good. It was good. So we are isolated. Most black schools were founded in the heart of the black community. But most of them were founded after the Civil War, and the black community then was free, and they wanted to have higher education in their community. So this is a challenge for us, but this is sacred land because it was originally owned by a black farmer in the 1840s and the 1850s, but it is a challenge. I loved it because we were isolated in the 60s, we were thinking hard, we would go out into the cities and raise heck in Philadelphia and Washington, and it allowed us to really build a community, but as they say, times have changed. 1 minute on Mrs. Renwick. Mrs. Renwick was the dietitian for Lincoln University. She was a fair-skinned lady with beautiful hair, beautiful dimples. Her husband was the barber. He was called Doc, and he would show up at the refectory with his book open and say, anybody, anybody? You'd make an appointment and you'd get your hair cut in the basement of Rendell Hall. And Mrs. Renwick was also an outstanding painter. So if you see anything by Gladys Renwick, please purchase it because she was amazing. She was a smoker, and she would stand in the cafeteria, and she was a big busted lady like this, and she would hold that cigarette in her mouth, and for some reason the ash never dropped. And we'd always say, has anyone seen Mrs. Renwick's Pall Mall drop? And none of us did, so we don't know how she did it. She was a fantastic woman.
Good morning. You are just a treasure. I'm just loving this. I'm part of the committee. I'm Professor Jean Waits Howard, and I've been doing oral histories. Now, I have several more to do, but I spoke to someone on the phone who I think was Joan Gomez. I talked to several people yesterday, but she said that there was a train that went from the village to like Westchester or something. Now I have to really talk to her. She talked so much. I was overwhelmed with all the information she was sharing with me. But she did mention a train, so that's something I will dig deep and find out more about this train, because I'd never heard about it. Dr. Millett, did you ever hear about the train? The tracks are there.
Yeah,
What?
there was a train. Yeah.
See? There was a train. The other question I have, I'm very distressed when you mentioned about the suicides, and my background is social work, so I'd like to, if you have any information regarding that, that's really very, very distressful to hear that. My mentor's husband was a psychiatrist here at Lincoln, I guess more in the, 80s, Dr. Warren E. Smith. But I never heard about anything during that time period, but I'd really like to know what you know history-wise in terms of what was leading to this problem on the campus. Thank you.
Please permit me to ask one more question. I'd like to get the person who spoke, who graduated from Lincoln.
Mimar?
What's your name, please?
My name is
Oliver
Oliver Franklin.
Franklin. Oliver Franklin, a sociologist. That's a famous sociologist, Oliver Franklin. All right. Let me share with my brother the person who recently came to Lincoln University. This is not as isolated as you think. Do you drive? I don't. Get a car. Get a vehicle, and soon, and drive the area. You would be very, very surprised. We need to get a bus.
Is it a bus?
Madam Provost, we need to get a bus for these students. Because I have a sense, no, I'm serious. I'm not laughing. This is not a laughing matter. Lincoln University doesn't understand where it's situated. We have multi-million-dollar homes 10 minutes from here. This is known as a bedroom community. And I'm hoping at some point that Lincoln University would reach out and get in touch with some of our people in this community. Some of them could come to Lincoln University and do nursing. We lost our education department, but other than that, they could have done education also. And sociology, I'm self-serving. So this is no longer. When I came in 1984, I would have agreed with you. Because when I bought a Volvo, I was the only Volvo going into Oxford on many, many, many occasions. No more. The Mercedes, the Maseratis, and other kind of cars. So this area is growing, has grown, and is continuing to grow. And those of us who live in the community like myself, we have to be extremely careful. Every day, I receive information. My house is not for sale. I don't know where these people get this idea from. I'm in the process of selling. I'm not. And please pass the word around, I'm not selling any of my homes. Because they want to buy. And there's a reason for that. My brother is no longer isolated. This is a gem. And if we are not very careful, and I mean very careful, we'll lose this gem. Business people understand where we are. We now have sewage in the village, you understand that? When I first came, we didn't have sewage. We had what Donald Trump, the word that he used, the S word. I'm not going to mention, I refuse to use that kind of language. Filthy language, I don't use it. Be careful. I'm not going to use it publicly. So we have to reach out. The university has to find ways of reaching out into this community, recruiting some of these people, and there are monies in the area. We live in an area where there's a tremendous amount of monies coming out of land. We have some people in Oxford who are multi-millionaires. You see them in the grocery store. You don't know. These are women. I know some of them. I know who they are. They have hundreds of acres of land, filthy rich. So, my brother, maybe one of these days I'll give you a little ride around. You'll see what I'm talking about.
Okay. We are nearing the conclusion.
Can I say one more word? I'm sorry. I just wanted to respond to you because, and I'm not just trying to sell the book, there's a lot, like Julian Bond's whole chapter, a lot of it is devoted to the whole suicides issue. And other kids also address it. And I came to a conclusion from interviewing people about why that was the case, but I really recommend that you read it because I think you'll draw your own conclusion and it's a little complicated. Thanks. Yeah.
I'm Shirley Jones White. I grew up in the area. I'm 82 years old now. So, in fact, my first job was working as a receptionist for Dr. Horace Bond when I graduated from high school in 1953. You know, there's a long history of Lincoln in Oxford. Oxford, when I grew up, I went to a segregated school until I was in 6th grade. And guess what? When you got to 6th grade, after that, you could go to the high school and be integrated. But you know, at that time also, when I grew up, the movies, there were 2 of them in Oxford, were segregated. If you check your files, and I have information on it, the Lincoln students picketed the Oxford Hotel, who would not serve them coffee. They actually sued Joe Krause, who owned the movie theaters. In fact, he was so prejudiced, when he lost the case, he shut down that movie theater. There was another theater there that was owned by John Ware, who became a state representative in Congress. So he immediately desegregated his theater. But the people in Oxford at that time, and I remember my grandmother very specifically saying, the students should leave things alone. We don't need them coming in here and staring things up because they're going to leave. So the blacks there were very comfortable with their situation. My grandmother never went to the movies anyhow. But her thing was, and a lot of the people thought so, they resented the Lincoln students at that time coming in and being activists, you know. But they, there was a lot written on it, you know, and they actually won the case, you know, and the schools were desegregated shortly after Brown versus the Board of Education, you know, so that was not a big factor. But that still, I'm graduating in 53, and we're still segregated at that time, and it was a few years after I left school that they didn't. But the Lincoln students desegregated the movies, and that was in the late 50s.
We are grateful. Can we give a hand to our great speaker and all of these reflections? We're going to we're going to invite you students to come back this evening at 6 p.m. in the library. And we are going to be in reading circles. And we have provided refreshments for you, as I love to say, chip, dip, and sip. But we want to continue to be together in community. And we invite you to come and learn. Students, have you enjoyed our guest speaker today? Yes. We're going to allow remarks, and then we will conclude with this quote. And yeah, introduce yourselves.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Charles Sutton. I am one of the members or members of the committee who helped write this grant to the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we're very fortunate to receive it. And again, Ms. Corinna Fales, I absolutely want to thank her again for providing insight, because one of the, and it's just two quick things for me, providing insight, because one of the things that it reminded me of is that, you know, it gives us an opportunity to hear about and perhaps even experience Lincoln, not just as a university, but as a community. Because, you know, we're here during the school year, but when we're gone in the summer, you know, it's still very much a viable community where people have to live their lives. So Lincoln it's much more than a university, and as Dr. Millett said, it truly is a gem and a very special community. A couple of things that I wanted to add to that, and Mr. Gray, Tyson Gray, I assume you're talking about your father, Hershey Gray. I really want to thank him as well, because he is a remarkable person, not to mention the fact that he gave me my first internship here as a student at Downingtown Industrial Agricultural School. But he and I, you know, have talked and we've worked, and he actually showed up at our event in the summer back in June and brought a wealth of information. And so, you know, we thank him, we thank you, we thank the students, you know, for showing up. We thank Dr. Ramsey, Dr. Millett, and other faculty for showing up, and other members of the committee. When I say we, that includes Professor Waits Howard, who's doing the oral history part for us, as well as Professor Sotilio and Dr. Button. One quick thing about you know, my role on this particular project is that and this is one of the reasons why I communicate you know, with your father, is that I also do a good bit of the genealogy as well as the history. I actually work with Mary Ann Russo, you know, on that Hensonville book. One of the things that I wanted to say, and Dr. Millett, you brought this up, is that when Ms. Fales was talking, it reminded me of when I was a student here, and very much how Lincoln was connected to the village, how folks in the village not only worked here, but they came here to enjoy it. You know, professors lived in the village, as students we would go there. It was very much connected, and so it was very interesting, you know, reflecting on my experience as a student here, and being involved with the village and hearing, you know, your stories, and it brings back so many different memories. One of the other things that I'll talk about, that your father, Hershey Gray, and I have talked about, and we've worked on a little bit, is the fact that looking at the history of Lincoln, and just as you talked about, how this was a community of farmers and communities of African-American farmers, and one gentleman in particular who owned a good bit of this land. I mean, from a personal standpoint, you know, it was actually my second great-grandmother, Sarah Jane Amos, who came back from Liberia after her husband, Thomas Amos, died in Liberia, and actually purchased the land to build her home from Edward Walls, or either donated or purchased the land from Edward Walls to build the house up on the campus that's just adjacent to the Hosanna Church, the Amos House. So again, like I said, this experience was very rich, and I appreciate it. You know, very much in line with what it is that we as a committee want to bring to the university. There's a number of different speakers that we're going to introduce to you this semester, a number of different activities that we're going to bring to you on this grant, so stay tuned, and by all means, pay attention and look out for the speakers that we're going to have. Also be mindful of the event tonight at 6 p.m. in the library, where we're having a reading circle where students are actually going to read excerpts from the books, and it will be an open discussion amongst us. It will also be your opportunity to explore the library, explore what we have over there, and perhaps learn a little bit more about Hensonville. And the book itself will actually be available for you to purchase. I'd like now to introduce another of our committee members, Dr. Button, to say a word or two about what we're doing.
You have just heard from living history on many fronts, and I represent the effort of all faculty across this campus to help students become more and more aware of what a fabulous, rich history Lincoln really represents. Even though we are somewhat isolated from the community, we are linked to the community. I've been here at Lincoln for almost 30 years, and one of the first stories I heard was from Dr. Richard Winchester, who was a history professor and the vice president for academic affairs for several years. He was involved in the first Desegregation Act in Oxford. When he went over, he was a white professor, and I'll never forget this story because it was so powerful. He went over there and asked, a student actually first, went over to ask for a room in the Oxford Hotel and was refused. The student came back to Lincoln, and they were all sitting here in the chapel waiting to see what would happen next. Dr. Winchester took up the challenge, went home, packed his bags. His wife was worried that he would move out, but in fact, he was going to the Oxford Hotel. He went to the Oxford Hotel, asked for a room, and was given one. Whereupon he said thank you, came back, reported to the students, and that was the beginning of the desegregation of the Oxford Hotel. It's part of Lincoln's history. Even before that, Lincoln students participated in the desegregation of the trolleys in Philadelphia. And so that is just, for me, that was the beginning of an exploration of Lincoln's rich involvement, not only in the local community, not only in the regional community, not only in the national community, but in the world. So when you hear about Lincoln's history in your classrooms, you are just touching the tip of an iceberg. And we hope that when you do independent studies that delve into the heritage of the university, you will read President Bond's book about how Lincoln was founded, how it sent missionaries to Liberia, how it trained African leaders in the 20th century. There's so much more to know about Lincoln than any of us can imagine. So I just want you to know that as a faculty, we are committed to helping you appreciate the opportunity you have to learn history. And history really, in many senses, can begin here at Lincoln. And so we have, I'm not going to say anymore, I could go on for quite a bit, but I just want to thank you personally for the opportunity to invest part of my career in studying more about the institution. And so keep studying, keep reading, keep inviting your professors to challenge you to learn more. And I thank you.
We are grateful again. Before you leave, we will read our conclusive statement. We are finished students, so we thank you. Let's stand and read that statement together. Let's read it together, and this will be our conclusion for today. We do acknowledge our provost. Amen. Let's read it together. In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught up in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. Lincolnians, have a blessed day, and we will convene tonight at 6 p.m. for more discussion.